On a cold autumn night in 1986, Jan-Michael Vincent left a late set on the outskirts of Burbank. The studio driver assigned to him, a quiet man named Leonard Price, insisted on leaving earlier than usual. The ride was short, almost uneventful, until Leonard vanished the next morning, never returning to the lot. Jan was the last person to see him. Leonard Price had been part of the studio's transportation crew for nearly a decade, known for his punctuality and the way he kept his beige station wagon immaculately clean. That night, however, something in his demeanor was off. As Jan stepped into the car, he noticed Leonard gripping the steering wheel before the engine even started, his knuckles pale under the dim lot lights. He offered a polite nod, but avoided any small talk, unusual for a man who normally asked about last week's scenes or the long shooting days. The streets were nearly empty as they eased onto the road, passing rows of warehouses and shuttered diners. Jan watched the blurred glow of street lamps streak across the window, the silence inside the car settling into something heavier than fatigue. Leonard kept checking his side mirror, not nervously, but with a rhythm as if he was following some internal rule. Jan assumed he was just exhausted from a long shift. Everyone on set was halfway through the drive. Leonard slowed at an intersection where the light had just turned yellow. He could have made it. Instead, he let the car roll gently to a stop. For a moment he stared straight ahead, hands still fixed on the wheel, shoulders squared. Then he said, almost to himself, "I wasn't supposed to take tonight's run." Jan leaned back, unsure whether to ask what he meant. Before he could speak, the light changed and Leonard started driving again as if nothing unusual had been said. The moment evaporated into the quiet hum of the engine. A few blocks later, Leonard pulled up to the hotel curb and shifted into park. He finally looked at Jan, his expression unexpectedly sincere. "Long night, get some rest," he said. But there was something else behind the words, an unspoken weight, something he might have been working up the courage to admit. Jan thanked him and stepped out into the cool air. When he turned back, Leonard gave a small, almost resigned nod before driving off into the empty boulevard. The next morning, when the crew gathered on set, his absence was the first thing people noticed. The station wagon wasn't in its usual spot. His name wasn't on the call sheet. No one had heard from him. A few asked Jan if the ride had seemed unusual. He tried to recall every detail, the silence, the mirror checks, the strange comment at the intersection, but none of it added up to anything clear. By noon, quiet speculation had spread through the lot. Leonard wasn't the type to simply disappear. Yet that night, he had seemed like a man preparing for something he hadn't wanted to say out loud. The following day, production resumed as planned, but a subtle tension clung to the edges of the set. People went about their tasks, lighting rigs adjusted, props shuffled, makeup brushes tapping softly, but conversations drifted back again and again to Leonard. Someone mentioned seeing him clock out early on previous nights. Another claimed he'd recently asked for a schedule change. Nothing sounded alarming on its own, yet together it formed a thin layer of unease. Jan, meanwhile, found himself replaying the short car ride with increasing detail, the glance in the side mirror, the hesitation at the light, the sentence that slipped through, too soft for a man who was usually so steady. "I wasn't supposed to take tonight's run." What did that even mean? Was it about the shift rotation, a personal obligation, or something else entirely? He tried not to dwell on it, but between takes, his mind kept drifting back to that pause at the intersection. Later that afternoon, Tom Riley, the transportation coordinator, approached Jan near the catering table. Tom was a broad-shouldered man with a sunburned neck and the sort of calm presence that came from decades spent wrangling drivers, actors, and schedules. He rarely looked rattled, but today he seemed unsettled. "Hey, Jan," he said quietly. "Can I ask you something about last night?" Jan nodded, sensing where this was going. Anything unusual about Leonard? He didn't check in today. He didn't call. Nothing. Jan hesitated before answering. He seemed tired, maybe, not talkative, but nothing dramatic. Tom exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Yeah, he'd mentioned being behind on some things at home, but this him not showing isn't him. He paused, lowering his voice even further. "You were his last drop-off." Jan acknowledged the truth silently. There was no accusation in Tom's tone, only the kind that settles in your stomach and refuses to leave. By early evening, the studio filed an official absence report, not a missing persons alert, just a note that an employee hadn't appeared for work. Drivers came and went. The day melted into cooler evening shadows, and a new shift began, but Leonard's name remained unmarked on the board. Jan stepped outside briefly to get some air. The sky was fading from orange to a deep purple, and the lot lights flickered awake. Across the parking area stood a younger driver, a man Jan didn't recognize, sorting through a clipboard. He looked up as Jan approached. "You replacing Leonard?" Jan asked lightly. The young man shook his head. "No idea. They called me in last minute. Said coverage was needed." There was no urgency in his tone, no implication that something serious had occurred. To him it was just another gig. But to Jan the normalcy felt strangely out of place, because the more he thought about that ride, the more he realized that Rend hadn't seemed confused or scared. He had seemed prepared. Prepared for an ending only he understood. 2 days passed, and Leonard's absence shifted from curious to quietly troubling. The studio continued its routine, call times, lighting tests, lunch breaks, but beneath the surface people were watching for updates that never came. Transportation staff whispered near the sheds. A few wondered aloud if Leonard had simply quit, but no one truly believed that. He wasn't the type to walk away without a word. Jan tried to focus on his scenes, but the memory of that final ride crept into every pause between takes. There was something about the way Leonard had spoken at the intersection, measured, deliberate, that felt like a clue buried in plain sight. Yet every time Jan revisited the moment, the meaning slipped through his fingers. On the third morning, Tom Riley approached him again, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. He asked if Jan had a minute. They stepped to the side of stage 5, the breeze drifting warm from the valley, carrying the smell of sun-baked asphalt. "Look," Tom began, "I talked to his sister. She hasn't heard from him either. Says he left home like normal that day. Nothing odd." Jan listened carefully. "Did she say if he was dealing with anything personal?" "She didn't think so," Tom replied. He opened the folder but didn't hand it over. "But she mentioned he'd been picking up extra shifts, trying to cover some bills maybe. Still, not enough to explain this." Jan nodded. There was a practical logic to that. Money always bent people's schedules, their moods, their choices. But it didn't explain the silence during their ride, or why Leonard had seemed burdened by something he wasn't willing to say. Tom finally handed Jan a page from the folder. It was Leonard's shift sheet, rows of dates, check-in times, vehicle log, everything orderly. Until the week of his disappearance, 2 entries had been crossed out with thick pen strokes, as if someone had corrected a mistake or tried to erase a concern. "He switched shifts twice last week," Tom said. "Volunteered for late-night runs. That's not like him. He preferred mornings." Tom paused. "But I can't figure out why he insisted on taking your pickup that night. He wasn't assigned to it." Jan folded the page carefully before returning it. "He told me he wasn't supposed to take that run. I thought he meant the rotation." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. "He said that?" Jan nodded. Tom looked out toward the lot, his expression shifting from concern to something more analytical. "Then someone must have asked him for a favor. Happens sometimes. A driver covers a shift swap off the book, but even then he'd have told us." Around them, the studio buzzed back to life. Crew members moved cables. A dolly track clattered into place, and the smell of coffee from the catering truck drifted over. It all felt strangely incompatible with the growing uncertainty surrounding Leonard. As Jan walked back to his trailer, he couldn't shake the feeling that the last person Leonard had spoken candidly to, however briefly, had been him. Not because Jan was special, but because Leonard had needed someone neutral, someone who someone who would simply listen if a sentence slipped out. And now that sentence was all Jan had. A thin thread in the dark. "I wasn't supposed to take tonight's run." But he had, and whatever came after, he'd gone into it willingly. By the end of the week, the studio had quietly replaced Leonard's name on the transportation schedule. Not officially, not with an announcement or a memo, but by simply filling his shifts with temporary drivers. It was the industry's way of acknowledging the uncomfortable life had to move, even when answers didn't. Still, a sense of unfinished business followed Jan through each day. He found himself scanning the lot whenever he arrived, half expecting to see the beige station wagon parked in its usual corner. But the space remained empty, sun-faded lines marking where it once sat. One afternoon during a break, Jan walked over to the transportation shed. Rows of clipboards hung neatly, each labeled with a driver's name. Leonard's was gone. A younger man named Gavin manned the desk, sorting through maintenance logs. He looked up briefly. "You looking for someone?" Gavin asked. "Just checking something," Jan said, his eyes moving across the walls of paperwork. Gavin shrugged. "If it's about Leonard, I don't know much. Heard he was a quiet guy. Reliable." He paused, tapping a pen against the desk. "But Tom's been digging through old schedules, something about an unauthorized switch." Jan leaned in slightly. "You mean the night he drove me?" "Maybe," Gavin replied. "I'm new, but everyone's been whispering. They say he took that run for someone else." "Any idea who?" Gavin shook his head. "That part's missing, literally. Pages were refiled. Some logs aren't where they should be." Jan felt a subtle shift in the room, a faint awareness that the story wasn't as simple as a man who abruptly abandoned his job. Studio logistics were rarely dramatic, but they were precise. When paperwork went missing, it meant someone had moved it. He stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the trailers. As he crossed the lot, he noticed a woman near the loading bay, a wardrobe assistant he vaguely recognized. She was smoking, eyes fixed on the distance. When Jan passed, she spoke without turning. "Leonard dropped something off for me last week." Jan paused. "You knew him?" "Not well," she said, still looking ahead. "But he returned a jacket I'd left in one of the vans. Perfect condition, folded, wrapped in plastic. He always did little things like that. Made sure everything was in order." There was a softness in her voice, a quiet respect that said more than any official report could. Jan asked gently, "Did he seem off recently?" This time she turned, her expression thoughtful. "Not off, just preoccupied. Like he was somewhere else in his head. Not worried, just deciding something." Jan absorbed the words. They aligned with his own impression from that night. Not a man frightened or unstable, but one carrying a decision already made. The wardrobe assistant dropped her cigarette and stepped on it. "You know what's odd?" she added. "He usually parked on the west side, but last week he switched to the smaller lot behind stage 2. Said it felt quieter." She shrugged. "Didn't think anything of it there." Jan thanked her and continued walking, his thoughts tightening into clearer patterns. Leonard had changed his parking spot, switched shifts, taken a run that wasn't his, checked his mirrors with intention, left early, not signs of fear, signs of preparation, as if he were closing out small pieces of his life, tidying the edges, making sure things were left in order. People didn't do that unless they were carrying something they didn't want others to share, something private, something final. The next Monday, Jan arrived on set earlier than usual. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of traffic from the nearby highway. As he walked across the lot, he noticed Tom Riley standing beside the transportation board, arms folded, eyes narrowed at a stack of forms. He didn't look up until Jan approached. "Morning," Tom said, though his tone suggested his mind was elsewhere. "Anything new?" Jan asked. Tom hesitated, then tapped the papers against his palm. "Depends on what you consider new. I found something in Leonard's locker." They stepped inside the small break room where driver lockers lined one wall. Most were cluttered jackets shoved in, keys dangling, half-empty water bottles rolling at the bottom. Leonard's, however, was unnervingly orderly. Tom pulled a small envelope from the top shelf. This was tucked behind his spare gloves. No name on it. He handed it to Jan. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Not a letter, just a list. 5 items, handwritten with the neat precision of someone who took pride in small tasks. Return jacket to wardrobe. Refuel Van Alba Thursday shift. Pick up Friday run. Final drop-off. The first four were mundane, studio chores, but the last line stood out with a quiet, unsettling finality. Jan looked up. Final drop-off could mean anything. Maybe, Tom said, but Leonard didn't talk like that. He was straightforward. He paused. This feels like something he wrote for himself. A checklist. Jan considered the list again. A man tying loose ends, completing tasks, preparing for something unsaid. Tom placed a hand on the locker door. We're not law enforcement. It's not our place to dig too deep. But I can't shake the feeling he left everything arranged. Jan nodded slowly. I felt the same during the drive. Tom gave him a long, searching look. What exactly happened in that car, Jan? You keep thinking about. Jan leaned against the locker row, recalling the ride with sharper clarity. He wasn't nervous, not even distracted. He was calm, too calm, like he'd already made peace with something. And the way he checked the mirror, it wasn't fear. It was habit, routine. Tom absorbed this silently. People don't just vanish like that. No, Jan agreed. They don't. Later that day, during a pause in filming, Jan walked to a smaller lot behind stage 2, the one Leonard had started using the week before. The asphalt was cracked, lined with faded white paint. A few crew cars were scattered around, but there was an emptiness to the space, as if it retained the outline of Leonard's station wagon. Jan stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of generators and the faint chatter of grips moving equipment. The lot felt disconnected from the rest of the studio, quieter, more isolated. He could understand why Leonard might have chosen it in his last days. As Jan turned to leave, he noticed an older man unloading equipment from a truck. The man glanced over, looking for someone. Just remembering someone, Jan replied. The man nodded knowingly. Good driver, that one. Always waved when I passed. The kind of guy who didn't get in the way. Jan felt a weight settle in his chest. Leonard had existed in the margins, quiet, reliable, unnoticed, until he wasn't there. Walking back toward the main buildings, Jan realized that everyone's memories of Leonard were fragments. A returned jacket, a polite nod, a mirror glance, a shift change. None of them dramatic, none extraordinary, just small human traces, pieces of a life that had been quietly winding down. By midweek, the conversations about Leonard had faded from casual curiosity into a kind of respectful hush. People still mentioned him, but only in brief remarks. He was a solid guy, or always early for call times. It was the way crews talked about someone who wasn't coming back, but whose absence left a subtle indentation on the daily rhythm. Jan found himself thinking less about the mystery and more about the man. The quiet precision, the folded jacket, the steady hands on the wheel, the way he seemed to catalogue the world around him, mirrors, lights, schedules, without ever drawing attention to himself. One evening, after filming wrapped early, Jan stepped outside the soundstage to stretch his legs. The sun was dropping low, painting the studio lot in muted orange. He walked toward the far side of the property, where a series of older storage units still stood from the 1960s. Few people used them anymore. Near one of the units he spotted a familiar silhouette, an older driver named Al Moreno, who had worked alongside Leonard for years. Al was leaning against a metal railing, sipping from a thermos. Jan approached. "Evening, Al." Al nodded. "Evening, Jan." He took another sip, then stared at the pavement, heard their closing out Leonard's paperwork. There was a heaviness to his voice, one that came from experience, from having seen people come and go through the decades. "You two worked together long?" Jan asked. "Long enough," Al replied. Leonard wasn't a talker, but he was steady, the kind of guy who carried quiet burdens. Al paused, rubbing his thumb over the thermos lid. "He mentioned something last week. Not directly, just a feeling." Jan leaned in slightly. "What kind of feeling?" Al exhaled slowly, like he needed to wrap things up, like he was finishing a chapter. He looked at Jan. "He asked me if I ever felt done. Not tired, not fed up, just done." The word hung between them, heavier than either expected. "What did you say?" Jan asked. "I told him everyone feels that way now and then." Al's gaze drifted toward the dimming skyline, but the way he asked, It wasn't casual. It was like he was checking how normal it sounded. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint echo of distant generator. Jan felt the detail lock into place with the others. The shift swaps, the quieter parking lot, the returned jacket, the meticulous checklist, the mirror glances. He never told anyone what he was dealing with, Jan asked. Leonard didn't like troubling people, Al said softly. He believed everyone had enough on their plate. Whatever he carried alone. For a moment neither spoke. The shadows lengthened around them. Finally, Al added, "You were the last person he drove. That means something. Maybe he trusted you to see him clearly, even if he didn't say much." Jan considered that, feeling the faint echo of their silent ride settle deeper into memory. Leonard hadn't said much, but everything he did say, every gesture, every pause, felt now like an intentional breadcrumb left behind. As Jan walked back toward the main lot, he found himself noticing the small things Leonard had always been attentive to, the placement of vehicles, the neatness of cables, the locked storage doors, the careful arrangement of objects on checklists. These were the habits of a man preparing the edges of his life, not to disappear dramatically, but to leave quietly, without burdening anyone. He had left no explanation, no confession, no request for help, only traces, small, tidy, human traces. And it was becoming painfully clear that whatever Leonard had been carrying, he had decided to put it down in his own way. As the days stretched on, the search for answers softened into something quieter, an acceptance that nothing dramatic would surface. No calls to the studio, no sightings, no sudden explanations. Leonard had stepped off the map with the same unobtrusive precision that had defined his entire life. Still, something tugged at Jan, a feeling he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, more like responsibility. He had witnessed Leonard's final hours of routine, the last outlines of a man closing his own story. And yet the meaning behind those gestures remained out of reach. Late one afternoon, between scenes, Jan returned to the smaller lot behind stage 2. The place held a stillness that felt deliberate. A few crew cars were scattered around, but the space Leonard favored, the one closest to the chain-link fence, remained empty. Jan stood there a moment before noticing an older woman in a navy skirt suit walking slowly along the row of spaces. She paused now and then, scanning the ground as though searching for something specific. Jan approached gently. "Ma'am," he said, "can I help you?" She turned and her expression softened with polite surprise. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wander. I'm looking for spot numbers, trying to find where my brother used to park." Jan's breath caught for a beat. "Your brother, Leonard?" She nodded. "I'm Margaret. He mentioned this spot once." Her eyes drifted toward the painted number on the pavement. "He said it was quieter back here." Jan offered a small, respectful nod. Margaret looked around, taking in the quiet lot, the faded paint, the distant hum of studio machinery. "This place suited him," she said softly. "He always liked quiet corners." They walked a few steps together, and Jan noticed she held a small envelope. She saw his glance and explained, "I cleaned out his room, found this tucked inside a book he was reading. It's nothing dramatic, just reflections. Lists. He made a lot of lists." "Did anything stand out?" Jan asked. Margaret hesitated, then carefully unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, creased, worn from being read many times. In Leonard's tidy handwriting were short, simple statements. "Get things in order. Leave nothing unfinished. Do not cause worry. Be remembered kindly." Margaret exhaled. "He wasn't ill as far as I know, but he'd been quieter lately, more thoughtful. I asked him if he was depressed. He smiled, said he was just sorting through life." Jan felt a gentle ache settle in his chest. It wasn't the ache of mystery, it was the ache of recognition. "I was the last person he drove," Jan said quietly. "He seemed resolved." Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. "That sounds like him. He didn't want anyone to feel responsible for him. He believed everyone had their own battles." They stood together in silence, the sky fading to a pale lavender above them. After a moment, Margaret added, I don't think he meant to disappear dramatically. I think he simply walked away from the noise. That was always his way, slipping out without making a scene. Jan considered that the tidy locker, the returned jacket, the completed tasks, the early departure on that final night, all of it painted the portrait of a man who had chosen a quiet exit, one rooted not in fear but in a deep, private decision. Before leaving, Margaret placed her hand on the fence, as though acknowledging the last place her brother's car had rested. Then she turned to Jan. "Thank you for being kind to him on that final ride." Jan shook his head. "He was kind to me." Margaret gave a faint, grateful smile before walking slowly toward the studio gate, the envelope held carefully in her hands. Jan remained a while longer, allowing the moment to settle. Leonard hadn't vanished into darkness or scandal. He had simply chosen a quieter path, one that left behind no spectacle, only traces of a thoughtful, orderly man making sense of his life in the only way he knew how. In the days that followed Margaret's visit, something shifted in Jan's understanding of the entire situation. The unanswered questions didn't feel like sharp edges anymore. They softened into something closer to a portrait, an incomplete one, yes, but gentle in its incompleteness. Leonard was not a puzzle to be solved. He was a man who valued order, quiet, and dignity, even in his disappearance. Still, Jan felt drawn to one last place, somewhere he and Leonard had crossed paths every evening before rides home. The transportation exit gate, a narrow concrete walkway beside a chain-link fence, lit by a single dim bulb that buzzed faintly at dusk. Leonard had often waited there, leaning against the railing, clipboard tucked under his arm, greeting actors and crew with small nods. Jan walked there one evening after wrap. The sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long, familiar shadows across the studio. As he approached the walkway, he noticed how ordinary it all felt. Just another aging corner of the lot, a piece of infrastructure nobody thought much about. Yet this was the place where Leonard's workdays routinely ended, the place where he lingered for a quiet moment before heading home. Jan stood there for a minute, then another, letting the atmosphere steep. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't mysterious. It was simply peaceful, the kind of spot Leonard would have appreciated. A soft scuff of footsteps behind him broke the silence. Jan turned to see the young driver, Gavin, approaching with a clipboard. "Didn't mean to interrupt," Gavin said. "Tom said you might be around here." "Just thinking," Jan replied. Gavin glanced toward the gate. "You know, I found something else today, in one of the older log boxes." He offered Jan a small card, no bigger than a piece of scrap paper, worn around the edges. It was a fuel receipt. Date, the morning of Leonard's disappearance. Vehicle, his station wagon. Time, 5:42 a.m. "He filled up the tank," Gavin said. "Completely. That's not what someone does if they're abandoning a car or walking away from a life in a dramatic way." Jan studied the receipt, turning it over between his fingers. A full tank, preparedness, consistency, order. It matched the rest of Leonard's final days, not as clues but as traits. He wasn't staging an escape or hiding from something. He was simply doing things neatly, as he always had. "Some people think the last thing a person does reveals everything," Gavin said quietly. "But I think sometimes it just reveals who they've always been." Jan appreciated the perspective. It felt grounded, human, not speculative or dramatic. They stood together a moment, listening to the faint hum of distant generator. Then Gavin added, almost shyly, "Leonard used to bring donuts for the drivers on Fridays. I never met him, but the older guys told me he didn't say much, just left the box on the table before his shift." Jan smiled softly. It was exactly the kind of gesture he'd expect from Leonard. Quiet kindness, no credit sought. As the lot lights flickered fully on, Jan slipped the fuel receipt into his jacket pocket, not as a clue, as a reminder of the man who had driven him through a short, uneventful ride that had grown heavier with hindsight. He walked back towards Stage 5, passing familiar sets and busy crew members. Life at the studio pulsed as always, rushed, bright, restless. Yet somewhere just outside its rhythms, Leonard had carved a path that belonged entirely to him. No dramatic goodbye, no spectacle, no sudden rupture, just a man who made lists, tied loose ends and walked into the quiet with the same steady, unobtrusive resolve he'd brought to every shift. And although Jan would never know where that path ultimately led, he now understood something far more important. Leonard didn't disappear from the world. He simply stepped beyond the reach of its noise. In the weeks that followed, the studio returned fully to its usual rhythm. New drivers, new call sheets, new late nights. Yet every so often, Jan found himself thinking of Leonard's quiet nod in the car, the way the man had seemed at peace with a choice no one else could name. There were no revelations, no hidden letters, no dramatic truths bubbling to the surface. Only the understanding that some lives taper off gently, like a dimming light no one notices until it's gone. Jan kept the fuel receipt in his wallet, not as evidence but as a small anchor to the memory of a man who lived carefully and left even more quietly. And whenever he passed the empty spot behind stage 2, he would slow his steps, wondering not what happened to Leonard, but whether the man had finally found the quiet he'd been arranging for so long.